There was a moment in Israel's history when the greatest threat to their faith was not an invading army, but another god. His name was Baal, a god of storms, a god of rain, a god many believed controlled the survival of entire nations. And shockingly, this was not just the god of Israel's enemies. Again and again, the Israelites themselves turned to him. Even after witnessing miracles, even after hearing the voices of prophets, even after seeing the power of the God who brought them out of Egypt, they still returned to Baal. Why? What kind of God could seduce an entire people who had seen the Red Sea split in two? What kind of worship could challenge the covenant between Israel and Yahweh? To answer that question, we must step into a forgotten world of ancient temples, royal conspiracies, and prophets who stood alone against an empire of belief. Because the story of Baal is not merely about idolatry. It is about a spiritual war that nearly erased the faith of Israel. And to understand how it began, we must first meet the God himself. Long before Israel crossed the Jordan, long before Joshua's armies saw the walls of Canaanite cities rising in the distance, another power already ruled the imagination of the land. His name was Baal. Not merely a name, but a title, Lord Master Owner. Yet in the religions of Canaan, Baal was far more than a title. He was the rider on the clouds, the storm bringer, the one men believed could open the heavens and send rain upon the earth. And in the ancient world, rain was not a convenience. It was survival. No rain meant no grain. No grain meant no bread. No bread meant hunger, collapse, and death. In that world, theology was never abstract. It was tied to the field, the vineyard, the womb, the flock, the next harvest. So when the peoples of Canaan bowed to Baal, they were not performing some distant ritual out of curiosity. They were pleading for life itself. Baal was not attractive because he was monstrous. He was attractive because he seemed useful. Centuries later, buried beneath the earth at ancient Ugarit tablets would be uncovered that opened a window into this forgotten world. In those texts, Baal appears as a divine warrior battling Yam the sea and contending even with Mot, the power of death. He is not portrayed as a minor village idol, but as a cosmic figure in a mythic struggle, a god whose victories were believed to secure fertility, order, and abundance for the land. The people did not think they were serving fantasy. They thought they were aligning themselves with the force that kept creation alive. When the Israelites entered Canaan, they did not simply inherit houses they had not built and vineyards they had not planted. They stepped into a land already saturated with altars, sacred poles, hilltop shrines, and rituals woven into the rhythm of everyday existence. Every field whispered Baal's name. Every storm seemed to testify to his power. Every season became a theological test. The Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt with plagues, with fire, with sea, and wilderness with manna falling from heaven. But in Canaan, the battle changed shape. In the desert, the question had been whether God could sustain them with no visible source of life. In Canaan, the question became more subtle and more dangerous. Would they still trust him when another god appeared to control the rain? That was the true seduction. Baal offered something immediate, local, tangible. Yahweh was the covenant God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the unseen king who demanded loyalty, holiness, remembrance. Baal seemed closer to the soil, closer to the clouds, closer to the desperate fears of farmers and families watching the sky. So Israel did not enter an empty stage. They entered a spiritual ecosystem already built around another throne. And soon the struggle would become far more than political or cultural. It would become intimate, relentless, and tragically personal. Because the greatest threat was not that Israel would meet Baal once, but that they would begin to believe they needed him. The fall did not begin with a trumpet blast, or with armies crossing the border, or with Israel waking one morning to declare that Yahweh was no longer their God. It began quietly, almost invisibly. That is how the most dangerous invasions often begin. The book of Judges preserves the pattern with chilling simplicity. Israel settles in the land. Israel prospers. The memory of deliverance grows dim. A generation rises that did not tremble at Sinai, did not walk through the sea, did not eat manna beneath the open sky. And in that fading of memory, another voice begins to sound more practical, more immediate, more useful. Israel turns to the Baals. Then the collapse begins. Enemies rise, fields are ravaged, villages burn, the people cry out, God sends a deliverer, there is peace for a time, and then the cycle starts again. It is one of the most haunting rhythms in all of Scripture because it reveals something painful. Israel did not usually abandon Yahweh in one dramatic act of rebellion. They drifted, they blended, they tried to hold two worlds together. Baal worship rarely arrived as a full replacement. It arrived as an addition, a supplement, a spiritual insurance policy. Yahweh remained the God of the fathers, the God of the Exodus, the God of national memory. But Baal became the God of the weather, the crops, the practical fears of daily life. Yahweh for identity, Baal for survival, Yahweh for history, Baal for harvest. And that is what made the crisis so devastating. Israel did not think they were necessarily rejecting the Lord. Many likely thought they were being wise, adaptive, realistic. Why not honor the God of Israel and also acknowledge the power the surrounding peoples feared? Why not cover every possibility, especially when the sky stayed hard and the soil seemed uncertain? Soon the compromise took material form. High places appeared. Sacred poles were raised. In some places, altars to Baal stood near places that still carried the memory of Yahweh. Two altars, two loyalties. One people slowly being divided from within. The battle was no longer fought only on battlefields. It was fought in fields, homes, marriages, festivals, and the hidden logic of the heart. The prophets would later expose the horror of this mixture with language that startled the nation. They called it adultery, covenant betrayal. Not because Israel had ceased to speak Yahweh's name, but because they had begun to speak it alongside another. And that is the deeper warning pulsing beneath Judges. The gravest danger was not open atheism. It was divided devotion. A people still using the language of faith while giving their trust to something else. If this moment in Israel's history feels uncomfortably close, that is because the prophets believed it revealed a permanent truth about the human soul. We are always tempted to trust what looks immediate over what is eternal. So as the cycle darkens and compromise reaches the throne itself, the next part will reveal the woman who turned this quiet corruption into a national system and pushed Israel toward one of its darkest hours. The struggle that had once moved through Israel like a whisper now entered the palace and took a throne. Its name was no longer merely Baal. Now it had a face, a will, a queen. Her name was Jezebel. She came from Sidon, daughter of Ethbaal, a Phoenician king, whose very name carried the mark of devotion to Baal. She did not arrive in Israel as a passive bride carried by diplomacy. She came as the bearer of a religion, a culture, and a vision of power. When King Ahab joined himself to her, the marriage was not merely political. It became theological. A covenant king in Israel had opened the royal house to another god. Baal worship was no longer creeping through villages alone. It was now clothed in royal authority. Under Ahab and Jezebel, this was no scattered compromise in hidden high places. It became organized, funded, protected. An altar to Baal rose in Samaria itself. Sacred symbols of Asherah were established beside it. Prophets of Baal ate at the queen's table. The palace fed them. The crown shielded them. The state itself began to speak the language of apostasy. And as Baal's voice grew louder, another voice was driven into silence. The prophets of Yahweh began to vanish, not by accident, not by slow neglect, by violence. Jezebel moved against them with ruthless intent. Some were slaughtered. Others escaped only because faithful hands hid them in caves and fed them with bread and water in secret. Imagine the terror of those days, the land of Moses, Joshua, and David now becoming a place where the servants of the Lord had to whisper in darkness, while the prophets of Baal walked openly in daylight beneath royal protection. This is what made Jezebel so dangerous. She was not merely an idolater. She was an architect of spiritual replacement. She understood that if Baal was to reign in Israel, Yahweh's witnesses had to be erased or at least driven into fear. The contest was no longer private. It had become national, official, systematic. For the first time in Israel's history, Baal worship was not simply tolerated. It was state-sponsored. And yet, in that hour of tightening darkness, when it seemed the covenant itself was being suffocated from within, one figure was already moving out of the wilderness toward the king. He had no army, no title, no court behind him, only a word, and that word was about to shut the heavens. Into that tightening darkness stepped a man who seemed to come from nowhere, as if the wilderness itself had sent him. Elijah the Tishbite. No royal blood, no priestly procession, no military command. He entered the story without ceremony, and yet his first word struck the kingdom like thunder. As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years except by my word. It was more than a prophecy. It was a direct assault on Baal's claim to power, because Baal was the storm god. Baal was supposed to command the clouds. Baal was supposed to send rain upon the land and prove his favor through harvest and abundance. But now the heavens were shut, and with every month of drought, Elijah's message grew sharper. This was no natural disaster. It was a theological exposure. The God of Israel was forcing the question no one wanted to answer: if Baal rules the skies, why can he not open them? Then the silence of the land became unbearable. Streams thinned, fields cracked, herds weakened. Hunger spread through the kingdom like a slow-moving judgment. And still, the deeper famine was not only for bread or water, but for truth. Israel had built its altars, chosen its compromises, and enthroned its illusions. Now the drought revealed what those illusions were worth. For a time, Elijah vanished into hidden places, sustained not by royal provision, but by the strange mercy of God. He was fed in isolation while the kingdom searched for him in rage. Ahab saw him as the troubler of Israel. But Elijah understood the real scandal: the nation had troubled itself by abandoning the covenant. Then came the challenge that would draw the entire conflict into a single terrible hour. Elijah summoned the king, the people, and the prophets of Baal to Mount Carmel. Not in secret, not in whispers, in public, before the nation. 2 altars, 2 sacrifices, 2 claims to heaven. The God who answered by fire would be shown as God indeed. It is difficult to overstate the tension of that moment. Hundreds of prophets of Baal gathered on the mountain, clothed in the confidence of royal support and public ritual. Opposite them stood one man, one prophet, one voice carrying the weight of the covenant into a crowd that had forgotten how to choose. Then Elijah spoke the question that cut deeper than drought itself. How long will you go limping between 2 opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him. And the people answered him not a word. That silence may be one of the most haunting sounds in Scripture. Because before the fire fell, before heaven answered, Israel was forced to face its own divided heart. And on Mount Carmel, that divided heart was about to be exposed before the eyes of an entire nation. Morning broke over Carmel with a terrible stillness, as though even the mountain understood that something more than ritual was about to take place. The prophets of Baal moved first, confident, numerous, clothed in the authority of spectacle. They called on the name of their God from morning until noon, circling the altar in a storm of motion and sound. Their voices rose over the stones. Their feet struck the earth. Their bodies twisted in ritual frenzy. "O Baal, answer us." Again and again the cry went out. But the sky remained closed. No wind shifted. No flame stirred. No voice came from heaven. The God of storm and thunder answered with silence. Hours passed and the scene became more unsettling. What began with confidence turned to strain, then desperation. Elijah's words cut through the noise with almost unbearable sharpness. Cry aloud, for he is a God. Perhaps he is deep in thought, or busy, or on a journey. Perhaps he sleeps and must be awakened. It was mockery, yes, but it was also exposure. A false god must always be animated by human effort, human performance, human blood. And blood soon came. The prophets gashed themselves with swords and lances, as was their custom, until it flowed over their bodies. This is one of the darkest details in the account because it reveals the brutal logic beneath idolatry. When the god does not answer, the worshiper offers more of himself, hoping pain can purchase power. They raved on into the afternoon, but heaven did not move. No voice, no answer, no one paid attention. Then Elijah stepped forward. The noise fell away, and what he did next was almost painfully simple. He repaired the altar of the Lord that had been thrown down, taking 12 stones according to the tribes of Israel, not merely building an altar, but calling a fractured people back to their covenant name. Then he laid the wood in order, placed the sacrifice upon it, and did something astonishing. He poured water over everything. Once, twice, 3 times. Until the sacrifice was soaked, the wood was drenched, and the trench around the altar overflowed. Humanly speaking, he made miracle impossible. Then Elijah prayed. No ecstatic screaming, no violence, no theater. Just a brief appeal to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, that this people might know that the Lord is God, and that he was turning their hearts back again. And then it happened. Fire fell from heaven. Not a spark, not a flicker. Fire that consumed the burnt offering, the wood, the stones, the dust, and even the water in the trench. In a single moment, the mountain became a courtroom, and the verdict was unmistakable. The people fell on their faces and cried out, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." It was one of the most dramatic reversals in all of biblical history. The God of rain had failed beneath an open sky, while the God of Israel answered with holy fire. And yet the deepest mystery of the story was still ahead, because even after fire from heaven, the struggle was not over. The question now was more haunting than ever. If the truth had been revealed so clearly, why did Israel keep returning to Baal? One would think Mount Carmel should have ended the story forever. Fire had fallen, the people had seen it, the verdict had been written in flame across the mountain, and yet Baal did not disappear. That is one of the most disturbing truths in the entire biblical record. Even after such a public humiliation, even after heaven itself had answered the pull of Baal, returned again and again as though the nation could not fully tear itself away. Why? Because Baal was never powerful only as a statue or a name or a myth from Canaan. Baal was powerful because he offered something the human heart has always craved: control. If the rains failed, there were rituals to perform. If fertility was threatened, there were rites to enact. If prosperity seemed distant, there were visible acts by which a person felt he could push the gods into response. Baal fit the logic of manipulation. He could be served as part of a system managed through ceremony, approached through technique. But Yahweh could not be managed. That was the deeper scandal. The God of Israel was not a local fertility deity bound to one hill, one storm, or one harvest season. He was holy, free, sovereign. He demanded not ritual performance as a substitute for truth, but covenant faithfulness, justice, mercy, exclusive loyalty. He asked for the one thing fallen humanity resists most: trust without control. And that made Baal easier, not truer, not greater, easier. The prophets understood this with painful clarity. This is why their language burned with such intensity. They were not simply denouncing another religion in abstract terms. They were exposing a seduction. Baal worship allowed Israel to keep the appearance of spirituality while avoiding the weight of repentance. It offered blessing without holiness, ritual without transformation, religion without surrender. Baal was not just a false god, he was a shortcut. And shortcuts have always been tempting to covenant people. This is why the struggle outlived Ahab, outlived Jezebel, outlived even the memory of Carmel. Because the issue was never only whether Israel would bow before a carved image. The deeper issue was whether they would love the Lord enough to reject every substitute that promised quicker security and more manageable power. So the story of Baal does not end as an ancient controversy buried in ruined temples. It becomes a mirror held up to every generation. And in the final part, that mirror turns toward us, because the shadow of Baal did not vanish with the ancient world. It only changed its clothing. You may be tempted to believe Baal died with the ruins of Canaan buried beneath broken altars, shattered pillars, and the dust of forgotten kingdoms. In one sense, that is true. The ancient cults passed away. Their temples fell. Their priests vanished. The inscriptions remained, but the fires on those high places went dark. And yet the prophets saw something deeper than the collapse of one religion. They saw a pattern in the human heart that could survive the death of every idol and still remain alive. Because Baal was never only a statue. Baal was a promise that life could be secured through visible power, a promise that blessing could be obtained through the right performance, a promise that the future could be controlled if one served the right master. In the ancient world, that promise was tied to rain, fertility, harvest, and survival. In later generations, the forms changed, but the seduction did not. What Baal represented was never confined to one carved image in one land. It was the recurring temptation to place ultimate trust in what appears immediate, useful, manageable, and strong. That is why the prophets spoke of idolatry in such fierce terms. They understood that idols are not dangerous merely because they are false in doctrine. They are dangerous because they reorganize desire. They teach people to love created things more than the Creator, to seek security apart from covenant faithfulness, to bow before power instead of holiness. In that sense, idolatry is not first an error of the hands. It is an error of the heart. The struggle with Baal did not end when the ancient shrines disappeared. It continues wherever human beings enthrone prosperity above truth, control above obedience, comfort above holiness, success above faithfulness. The names are different now. The altars are more sophisticated. The rituals no longer look like those on Carmel, but the deeper question has not changed. What do we trust for life? That is why this story matters so much. Not because we are being asked to fear a forgotten Canaanite god, but because we are being asked to confront the ancient pattern that nearly consumed Israel itself. A people chosen by God, delivered by miracles, instructed by prophets, and still vulnerable to substitutes. So the story of Baal ends where all great biblical warnings end, not in the past, but in the present. The fire on Carmel has faded into history, but its question still burns. If the Lord is God, follow him. And if not, then every generation will find its own Baal and call that bondage freedom. The struggle between Yahweh and Baal was never simply a clash between two ancient gods carved in stone. It was a confrontation between two visions of reality. One promised power that could be controlled, blessings that could be manipulated, and security that seemed immediate and visible. The other demanded something far more difficult: faith, trust, loyalty to a God who could not be controlled, only followed. Again and again, Israel stood at that crossroads. Sometimes they chose the covenant, sometimes they chose Baal. And if we are honest, that same crossroads still appears in every generation. So as this story closes, the ancient question remains quietly alive. What do we trust when the sky seems silent? If this journey into the hidden layers of biblical history stirred something in you, take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who loves deep Bible stories, and subscribe to join this growing community of explorers. And I would love to hear your thoughts. What part of this story challenged you the most? Stay with us and watch the next video, because the ancient world still holds mysteries that continue to shape the story of faith today.